All right, welcome back for another deep dive, everybody. Today,
Looking forward to this one.
yeah, this one is hyper-local.
Okay.
We are going to Bangor, Maine.
Right.
We're going to be looking at the 2024 annual report from the Advisory Committee on Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Human Rights,
Okay.
ACREIHR.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, I know. I know what you're thinking.
Okay.
Bangor, Maine, what does that have to do with, the rest of the world?
Right.
But this report is a fascinating look at how one community is really trying to grapple with some very, very complex issues. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from their approach.
It's so true what you're saying. Often we look at, national level or even global initiatives, but some of the most interesting and innovative work is happening right at the local level. And this report, I think, offers a really valuable case study on how these kinds of initiatives are structured, how they're actually put into practice, what kind of impact they have on communities.
Yeah, so the ACREIHR, just give everybody a little bit of background. This is a committee that is dedicated to, as the name suggests, promoting racial equity, inclusion, and human rights in Bangor, Maine.
Right.
And they have a pretty powerful mission statement to promote equity, foster inclusion, and address systemic disparities within the community.
It's good. It's to the point. It's clear. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk.
Well, and that's what's so important, right? I mean, mission statements are great, but it's really about how those words are translated into tangible actions. And that's where I think the ACREIHR really stands out.
Totally. And if you look at their progress and achievement section, it's pretty impressive. They had a hand in influencing the inclusion of equity considerations in 3 major city policies this year.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about the new zoning regulations, the overhaul of their community policing program, and the allocation of funds for affordable housing projects.
Those are some pretty substantial areas to be making an impact. I mean, that suggests that they're really thinking about systemic change, not just sort of addressing things on the surface, but really getting down to the root causes of some of these issues.
Yeah, and they are not just working behind closed doors either. They engaged over 500 community members through various events and surveys.
Wow.
And they even ran a citywide campaign educating folks about implicit bias.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, that's crucial, right? Because you can't really address systemic issues without also engaging the community, fostering that awareness and understanding at the grassroots level.
Absolutely. Okay, let's zoom in on some specific initiatives that caught my eye.
Right.
One that I thought was particularly interesting was their policy review structure.
Oh, tell me more about that.
So they have developed a system to review every single city policy and ordinance for equity implications.
Wow, that's ambitious. But really important work. I mean, think about it. So many policies that we take for granted can actually perpetuate disparities. And by taking this kind of proactive approach, the ACREIHR is really trying to get ahead of those issues.
Totally agree. And then there's this other thing called the Business Equity Index.
Oh, interesting.
And they're partnering with the Chamber of Commerce on this.
Okay.
Which I think is huge.
That's a big deal. Getting the business community involved in these kinds of conversations is absolutely essential if you want to create a truly equitable economy.
Exactly. And it's not just about, the current generation. They're also thinking about the future.
Yeah.
They're collaborating with the school district's DEIB committee, which I think shows their long-term vision.
Yeah. Working with the schools is so important. I mean, that's where we really start to see sustainable change take root. If you can create more equitable and inclusive learning environments for our kids, that's going to have a ripple effect for generations to come.
Yeah, and get this, they even played a role in supporting the city council's efforts to address homelessness.
Oh, wow.
Which is a really pressing issue in Bangor right now.
Right.
They advocated for allocating funds for a new shelter. And they even helped to develop a plan to provide wraparound services for folks experiencing homelessness.
That's fantastic. I mean, it really shows that they're not just focused on these abstract concepts of equity and inclusion, but they're really thinking about the practical needs of the most vulnerable members of their community.
Exactly. So I think we've gotten a good sense of the scope of their work.
Yeah.
But what I also love about this report is it gives us a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at their process. They have all these summaries from their monthly meetings.
Oh, that's great. I mean, it's one thing to read about their achievements in the abstract, but I think it's so much more valuable to see how they actually work. What are the challenges they face? How do they make decisions?
Totally. And it's interesting to see how those discussions unfold.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one meeting that stood out to me was their February session with the city planner.
Oh, okay.
They were discussing available grants for equity-focused projects.
So they're being proactive. I like that they're not just waiting for opportunities to come their way. They're actively seeking out resources to further their work.
Exactly. And then in March, they did a deep dive into the city's equity audit.
Okay.
Really looking at the scores, trying to figure out, okay, where are the areas for improvement? And they're really paying attention to the details.
It's great to see that they're taking this data-driven approach because, it's one thing to have good intentions, but it's another thing to actually track your progress, make sure you're holding yourself accountable.
Totally. And it wasn't all just about crunching numbers. In April, they provided feedback on the city's website accessibility audit.
Oh, interesting.
Going so far as to offer guidance on the language.
Yeah.
That should be used on the new website.
I love that it shows that they're really thinking about accessibility in a holistic way. It's not just about making sure people can physically access the website, but also that the language and the content are inclusive and easy to understand.
Yes, and the May was all about housing.
Okay.
They reviewed the Bangor housing study and the rental registry pilot program, and they were really focused on finding solutions to the city's affordable housing challenges.
That's a huge issue everywhere these days, and it's great to see that they're making it a priority.
And then in June, they presented their strategic plan for the business equity score to the Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, nice. So they're making progress on that initiative.
Yeah, it's really cool to see, how they're putting these ideas into action.
It's one thing to have a report, but it's another thing to actually develop these tools and strategies that can drive change.
Absolutely. So it's clear from looking at all these meeting summaries that the ACREIHR is not just, a committee that meets once a month to chat about good intentions.
Right.
They are really rolling up their sleeves and getting into the nitty-gritty of making Bangor a more equitable place.
I'm really impressed by what I'm hearing. They seem to have this really nice balance of big picture thinking with attention to detail. They're tackling systemic issues, but they're also not afraid to get into the weeds and figure out the practical aspects of implementation.
Yeah, and they're clearly not afraid to collaborate. They're working with city officials, community organizations, the business sector. They understand that to create lasting change, you need to have a collective effort.
It's about building those bridges, bringing people together around a shared vision.
Yes. Now, before we move on to their goals for 2025,
I
think it's important to take a moment and just acknowledge the people who make up this committee. Because I think understanding the composition of the committee can give us some valuable insights into, their perspectives, their expertise, and their potential strengths.
Absolutely. I mean, it's always interesting to see who's driving these kinds of initiatives. What are their backgrounds? What are their experiences? What are the perspectives they bring to the table?
So we have Liana Fellis as chair and Katie Bryden as vice chair.
Okay.
Both very strong advocates for social justice in Bangor. And they lead a really diverse group of members, representing a range of backgrounds and experiences. We've got educators, social workers, business owners, faith leaders, even a student representative.
That diversity is so important because when you're dealing with complex issues like racial equity and inclusion, you need to be able to consider a wide range of viewpoints.
Absolutely. And it's not just the committee members themselves. We also have City Manager Debbie Laurie and Assistant City Manager Courtney O'Donnell actively involved in this work.
Oh, that's great to hear. Having that buy-in from city leadership is really essential because it sends a signal that these issues are a priority for the entire municipality.
Absolutely. So we've gotten a good understanding of who's behind the ACREIHR, what they've accomplished so far. But what about the future? What are their goals for 2025?
They've set some pretty ambitious goals for 2025.
They have. They really have. So let's take a look at some of them.
Okay.
First up, they want to strengthen their partnerships with some key organizations like the NAACP, the Maine Multicultural Center, and the Bangor Public Library.
Those are all great organizations to be partnering with. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you want to make a real impact, you need to be working with groups that already have a strong presence in the community.
Yeah, and it's not just about expanding outward. They also want to see greater involvement from the city council.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you want to see real policy changes happen, you need to have the support of elected officials.
Exactly. And speaking of concrete action, they're planning to develop a comprehensive equity action plan.
That's great. A lot of times these committees, they'll just kind of put out a report with a bunch of recommendations. But this sounds like they're actually going to create a roadmap with measurable benchmarks. timelines, really holding themselves accountable.
Yeah, and I love this next one. They're advocating for increased representation of marginalized groups in local decision-making processes.
That's so important. For too long, these decisions have been made by people in power who don't necessarily represent the diversity of the community.
Okay, so those are some pretty ambitious goals.
They are.
But let's be realistic. What hurdles might they face trying to achieve all this?
Well, one challenge I can think of right off the bat is resources.
Yeah.
These committees often operate with very limited budgets, limited staff, so, finding the funding and support to actually implement these plans can be a real struggle.
And they're also bound to face some pushback.
Right.
Change can be uncomfortable.
It can. And there are always going to be people who benefit from the status quo.
Yeah.
And they're not going to want to give up that power.
So given those challenges, how will we even know if the ACREIHR has been successful in 2025?
Well, I think one way to measure their success is to look at their stated goals.
Okay.
So have they strengthened those partnerships? Is the city council more actively involved in their work? Have they developed and implemented that equity action plan? And most importantly, are marginalized communities actually seeing tangible improvements in their lives?
So it's not just about creating a plan. It's about making a real difference.
Exactly, in the lives of people.
So we've explored their achievements. We've delved into their goals. We've even peeked behind the scenes at their working process. I'm feeling pretty inspired. What about you?
I am too. I think what's so exciting about this report is that it shows that real change is possible at the local level. Often we feel powerless to address these big systemic issues, but the ACREIHR's work is a reminder that even small communities can make a big difference.
It's about those dedicated individuals, right?
Yeah.
Who are willing to step up and put in the work.
It's about having a vision and then taking those concrete steps to make that vision a reality.
So before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you and for our listeners.
Okay, shoot.
We've been talking about Bangor, Maine, but what about our own communities?
Right.
What steps can we take to promote greater racial equity and inclusion where we live?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. It's easy to get inspired by other people's work, but how do we translate that inspiration into action?
Well, I think it starts with understanding our own communities. What are the specific challenges and opportunities in our own backyard?
Yeah, like could a committee like the ACREIHR work in our city? What would it take to make that happen?
Those are great questions to ask, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But I think the key is to start by having those conversations, connecting with people who are already doing this work, and figuring out how we can contribute.
And for anyone listening who wants to learn more about the ACREIHR, we will have a link to their full report in the show notes.
Definitely check it out. It's an inspiring read.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay, so they've done all this amazing work, right?
Right.
Where do we even begin?
Well, I think, one of the things that really stood out to me in this report was their focus on policy review.
Oh.
Which is something that often gets overlooked, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think when people think about like activism and social justice, they think about like rallies and protests.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Right. But actually going through the rule books and seeing if they're fair, it's not as glamorous.
Yeah.
But it's so important.
So can you give me an example? What kind of policies?
Sure. Zoning regulations, for example.
Okay. Zoning. Okay.
They determine
Well,
where businesses and housing can be located. And that can have a huge impact on economic opportunities for different communities.
okay. So like, give me a concrete example. What could go wrong with zoning?
Well, let's say there's a zoning ordinance that only allows certain types of businesses to operate in affluent areas.
Right. So
That could create a barrier for entrepreneurs in underserved communities.
yeah, because they can't afford to, rent a space.
Exactly. Or buy a property in those areas.
Or what if zoning pushes certain people out of their neighborhoods?
Oh, absolutely. Gentrification is a huge problem. And zoning can definitely play a role in that.
Okay, so I'm starting to see now how policy can really have an effect on people's lives.
It's all connected.
Yeah. So we should all be like combing through our city ordinances.
I mean, it's a good place to start. It's not the only thing.
Okay. What else can we do?
Well, I think building relationships is crucial.
Okay. How do we do that?
Reach out to organizations that are already doing this work in your community.
Okay.
Connect with community leaders from diverse backgrounds. Listen to their experiences. Learn from their expertise. Find ways to collaborate.
So we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right?
Exactly.
We can learn from what others have already done.
And I think just having conversations about these issues is so important.
Yeah. But those conversations can be tough sometimes.
They can be, but I think the key is to approach them with empathy and respect and a willingness to listen.
Right, even if you don't agree with everything the other person is saying.
Even if you disagree, you can still have a productive conversation.
Policy review, building relationships, having these tough conversations. What else?
I think another important thing is to support local initiatives and organizations.
Okay. So how do we do that?
Volunteer your time.
Okay. Donate resources. Spread the word.
Exactly. Put your actions where your good intentions are.
Right.
And finally, don't underestimate the power of your own voice.
What do you mean by that?
Speak up against injustice.
Okay.
Challenge discriminatory practices. Use your platform to amplify the voices of those who are often marginalized.
Love that. Be the change.
Perfectly.
Okay. I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about, a lot to chew on. Any final words of wisdom before we sign off?
I think, just to reiterate, creating a more equitable and just society, it's an ongoing process. It takes sustained effort, collaboration, a willingness to challenge the status quo. But as the work of the ACREIHR demonstrates, it's a journey worth taking.
It is. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of local activism. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Remember, change starts at home.